Mom, we really don't have room right now. Those were the words my son used when I asked if I could stay with him for just 1 week. 1 week. 7 days. That was all I needed while repairs were being completed in my apartment building after a plumbing issue damaged several units, including mine. I sat quietly at my small kitchen table, holding my phone with both hands as if it might somehow change what I had just heard. Through the window, I could see the late afternoon sun stretching across the parking lot. Everything looked normal. Cars came and went. A neighbor walked her dog. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. But something inside me had shifted. I understand, sweetheart, I replied. My voice sounded calm. Even to me. Ethan hesitated for a second. Maybe try one of those extended stay places for a few days, he suggested. Julie's working from home now, and the guest room is full of storage boxes. Storage boxes. I almost smiled at that. For 30 years, I had kept every birthday card he ever made me. Every school picture. Every handmade ornament from elementary school Christmas programs. I had found room for all of it. Yet somehow there wasn't room for me. Don't worry about me, I said. I'll figure something out. We ended the call a moment later. No argument. No tears. No dramatic scene. Just silence. The kind that settles into a room and stays there. I placed the phone on the table and looked around my apartment. The place was small but comfortable. A faded blue recliner sat beside the window. Family photographs lined the bookshelf. My late husband's favorite coffee mug still rested on the kitchen counter even though he had been gone for 4 years. I had spent decades building a life centered around family. Birthdays. Holidays. School events. Weekend dinners. Whenever Ethan needed help, I was there. When he lost his first job, I helped him pay his rent. When he and Julie bought their first home, I contributed part of my savings for the down payment. I never kept score. Mothers aren't supposed to. Yet that evening, for the first time, I wondered whether love could slowly become invisible. I stood up and walked into my bedroom. Cardboard boxes were stacked neatly against one wall. Most people would have seen clutter. I saw something else. Possibility. Change. Freedom. I opened my closet and looked at the clothes hanging inside. Some hadn't been worn in years. I ran my hand along the sleeves and smiled softly. The sadness was still there. Of course it was. But underneath it, something unexpected had begun to grow. Clarity. I no longer felt angry. I no longer felt disappointed. I simply felt awake. 3 days later, I sold everything I wasn't taking with me. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For years, that had been my habit. My husband used to joke that I trusted the morning more than the night. Back then, I would make coffee for 2. Now I make coffee for 1. I stood by the kitchen window holding a warm mug and watched the sky slowly brighten over the parking lot. The decision I had made no longer felt frightening. It felt overdue. By 8 o'clock, I had scheduled appointments with 3 estate sale companies. The first representative arrived just after lunch. A pleasant woman named Karen walked through the apartment with a clipboard in her hand. She paused occasionally to ask questions about furniture, artwork, and antiques. I answered calmly. The oak dining table. The china cabinet. The antique clock that had belonged to my grandfather. Piece after piece. Memory after memory. At one point, she stopped beside a framed photograph of Ethan at age 10. He was standing proudly beside a science fair project, grinning from ear to ear. Your grandson, she asked. My son, I replied. She smiled. You must be very proud. I looked at the picture for a moment. I always have been. After she left, the apartment felt strangely quiet. Not sad. Just different. I opened a closet and began sorting through old boxes. Inside were decades of family history. Birthday cards. School report cards. Crayon drawings. Handwritten notes. One card caught my attention. Ethan had written it when he was 8 years old. The letters were crooked and uneven. Dear Mom, thank you for always taking care of me. I love you forever. I sat on the edge of the bed holding that card for a long time. Not because it made me cry. It did not. It reminded me of something important. The little boy who wrote those words had loved me completely. Life had simply carried us in different directions. Sometimes people do not become cruel. Sometimes they become comfortable. Comfortable enough to assume you will always be there no matter how little space they make for you. That afternoon, I rented a small storage unit 20 miles away. Not because I planned to keep much. Quite the opposite. Most of what I owned would be sold, donated, or given away. I only kept what truly mattered. A few photographs. My husband's wedding band. Several letters. Some personal keepsakes. Everything else belonged to a life I was quietly leaving behind. As evening approached, my phone buzzed. A text message from Ethan appeared on the screen. "Hope everything is working out, Mom. Let me know if you need anything." I stared at the message for several seconds. Then I smiled softly and locked the screen without replying. For the first time in many years, I was not waiting for someone else to decide where I belonged. I was deciding that for myself. And somewhere between the packed boxes and the empty shelves, I realized I was not losing a home. I was making room for a new one. Over the next 2 days, the apartment slowly stopped looking like a home and started looking like a memory. The bookshelf grew emptier. The walls looked wider. The familiar comfort of routine gave way to the quiet rhythm of preparation. Every morning, I woke up early, made a single cup of coffee, and sat beside the window before beginning another day of sorting. It was surprising how much of a life could fit inside cardboard boxes. One afternoon, I found a stack of old photo albums tucked away on the highest shelf of my closet. Dust covered the corners. I carried them to the kitchen table and began turning pages. There was Ethan at 12 years old holding a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. There we were at Yellowstone during a summer road trip. There was my husband standing beside our first house, smiling proudly after painting the front porch himself. For a moment, I forgot about moving. I forgot about decisions. I simply sat. There surrounded by pieces of a life that had once felt permanent. Then my phone rang. Julie's name appeared on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. "Hello," I answered. Her voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. "Hi, Ava. I just wanted to check on you. Ethan mentioned your apartment situation." "That is kind of you," I replied. "Everything is under control." There was a brief silence. "Good," she said. "I know these things can be stressful at your age." At your age. The words were not cruel. Not directly. Yet they lingered. I smiled to myself. A few years earlier, that comment might have bothered me. Now it felt strangely unimportant. We exchanged a few more polite sentences before ending the call. When I set the phone down, I realized something. Neither Julie nor Ethan had asked where I planned to stay. Neither had asked whether I needed help packing. Neither had offered to visit. They simply assumed I would manage somehow. And they were right. I would. Later that evening, I met with a realtor. Not because I intended to buy another place nearby. Quite the opposite. I asked questions about smaller communities, coastal towns, and retirement-friendly areas several states away. Places where nobody knew my history. Places where every street corner did not hold a memory. The realtor seemed surprised by my interest. "That is quite a change," she said. "Maybe," I answered. "Or maybe it is simply time." That night, after dinner, I opened my laptop and reviewed several possibilities. A quiet town near the Oregon coast caught my attention. Small population. Friendly community. Walking paths near the water. A local library. A weekly farmer's market. The photographs showed people smiling beneath cloudy skies and tall pine trees. It looked peaceful. It looked like a place where nobody expected me to remain exactly who I had always been. Before going to bed, I drafted several notes and tucked them into a folder. Not goodbye letters. Not yet. More like unfinished conversations. Thoughts I had never spoken aloud. The apartment around me felt lighter than ever. Less crowded. Less complicated. For the first time in years, the future did not feel smaller than the past. It felt larger. The estate sale began on a bright Saturday morning. By 9 o'clock, strangers were walking through the apartment carrying small baskets and measuring furniture with careful eyes. Some admired the dining table. Others paused in front of framed photographs or old lamps. I spent most of the morning sitting quietly near the window, answering occasional questions and watching pieces of my former life find new owners. Surprisingly, it did not hurt as much as I expected. Every object carried a memory, but I had finally learned something important. The memory stayed even when the object was gone. Around noon, my neighbor Carol stopped by. She had lived across the hall for nearly 6 years. We had shared countless cups of coffee and more conversations than I could remember. She looked around at the half-empty apartment and shook her head slowly. "I still cannot believe you are doing this," she said. "Neither can I replied with a smile. Carol sat beside me and lowered her voice. "Have you told Ethan?" I glanced toward the growing pile of sold item receipts on the kitchen counter. "No." "Why not?" she asked. I thought about that question for a moment. The answer was simple. For years, I had explained everything. Every decision. Every concern. Every plan. This time, I wanted to make a choice without asking for permission, approval, or understanding. "Because this is the first thing I have done entirely for myself in a very long time," I said. Carol squeezed my hand and nodded. She seemed to understand. Later that afternoon, after most of the visitors had left, I walked through the apartment one room at a time. The living room echoed now. The bedroom looked larger than ever. Even the kitchen seemed unfamiliar. I opened the refrigerator and laughed softly. There was almost nothing left inside except a carton of milk and a container of strawberries. The place no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a departure gate before a long journey. That evening, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan. "Just checking in. How are things going?" I stared at the screen. Such a simple question. Yet it arrived days after the moment when I had needed him most. I typed a short reply. "Everything is fine. I hope you and Julie are doing well." A minute later, 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Finally, a single message arrived. "Glad to hear it." I set the phone aside and returned to my laptop. The coastal town in Oregon continued to pull at my attention. I studied maps, housing listings, community events, photographs of the harbor. The more I learned, the more certain I became. Before going to bed, I purchased a one-way plane ticket scheduled for the following week. My heart beat a little faster after I clicked confirm. Not from fear. From anticipation. The confirmation email arrived seconds later. I read it twice. Then I closed the laptop and looked around the nearly empty room. For years, I had believed security came from staying close to familiar places and familiar people. Now I was beginning to suspect that sometimes security came from trusting yourself enough to start over. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, a new life was already waiting for me. The following week moved faster than I expected. Every day seemed to remove another layer of the life I had known for decades. The movers arrived on Tuesday morning and loaded the few items I had decided to keep into a small truck. Several boxes of photographs. A pair of worn quilts. My husband's wedding band. A handful of books that had traveled with me through different chapters of life. Everything else was gone. By Wednesday afternoon, the apartment was almost empty. The walls looked bare. The closets stood open and vacant. Even my footsteps sounded different against the floor. I spent the final evening sitting in a folding chair near the window because all the other furniture had already been sold. Outside, the parking lot lights flickered on one by one as darkness settled across the neighborhood. I watched familiar faces come and go. Neighbors carrying groceries. Children riding bicycles. People living ordinary lives. For years, I had believed this place would be part of my future. Now it was simply part of my past. Before going to bed, I opened the folder that contained the notes I had been writing. Some were only a few sentences long. Others filled entire pages. One note was addressed to Ethan. I read it carefully before placing it back inside the folder. It was not angry. It was not accusing. It simply told the truth. The truth about loneliness. The truth about growing older. The truth about what it feels like when the people you love slowly stop seeing you as someone who still needs a place in their lives. The next morning, I left the apartment for the last time. I paused at the doorway and looked back. The rooms were empty now. Quiet. Waiting for someone else's story to begin. I closed the door gently and handed the keys to the property manager. There were no tears. No dramatic farewell. Just a deep breath and a sense of peace I had not felt in years. At the airport, I checked one suitcase and carried a small shoulder bag. That was all I needed. As I sat waiting for my flight, my phone vibrated. Ethan was calling. I stared at his name on the screen. Once, twice, 3 times. The call went unanswered. A voicemail notification appeared moments later. Then another text message. Mom, call me when you get a chance. I need to ask you something. I slipped the phone back into my purse. Boarding began a few minutes later. As I walked down the jet bridge, I felt lighter than I had in a very long time. Not because I was leaving people behind. Because I was finally moving toward something instead of waiting for something. Thousands of feet above the clouds, as the plane carried me west toward Oregon, I looked out the window and smiled. At that exact moment, hundreds of miles away, Ethan was standing inside my apartment building staring at an empty unit that no longer contained a single trace of my life. When Ethan stepped into the leasing office that afternoon, he expected to find me frustrated, perhaps staying temporarily in a hotel while repairs continued. Instead, he found an empty apartment and a property manager holding a stack of paperwork. According to the woman later, he stood there for several seconds without saying anything. He simply stared through the open doorway into rooms that no longer contained furniture, photographs, or even a coffee mug. The apartment looked as though nobody had lived there at all. Back in Oregon, I knew none of this yet. I was standing on a wooden boardwalk overlooking a quiet harbor lined with fishing boats and small shops. A cool breeze drifted in from the water, carrying the scent of salt and pine. The town was exactly as peaceful as the photographs had promised. For the first time in years, nobody expected anything from me. Nobody needed a favor. Nobody was waiting for me to solve a problem. I checked into a modest apartment overlooking the bay and spent the afternoon unpacking the few belongings I had brought. Meanwhile, Ethan was asking questions. Where had I gone? When had I left? Had I given a forwarding address? The answers frustrated him. The property manager explained that everything had been handled properly. The lease had ended. The apartment had been cleared out. The keys had been returned. Beyond that, there was nothing more to share. By early evening, he had called me 6 times. I listened to the voicemails later that night while sitting beside my new window. At first, his tone sounded merely confused. By the 3rd message, concern had replaced confusion. By the 6th, something else had appeared. Regret. Mom, please call me, he said. I did not realize things were happening this fast. I replayed that sentence twice. Not because it made me angry. Because it revealed something important. He had not realized. That was the heart of it. He had assumed I would remain exactly where I had always been. Available. Predictable. Waiting. The next morning, I walked through town carrying a paper cup of coffee and watching seagulls circle above the harbor. Several local shop owners greeted me warmly. A woman at the bookstore recommended 3 novels. An elderly couple invited me to join a community walking group that met every Saturday morning. Simple interactions. Small kindnesses. Yet each one felt surprisingly meaningful. Later that day, another voicemail arrived. This time Ethan sounded different. Quieter. Mom, I went by your apartment because I wanted to help. I should have done that sooner. Please call me when you can. I sat quietly for a moment after listening. Then I opened the folder containing the note I had written weeks earlier. The note I had never sent. I read it again from beginning to end. Every word remained true. Every feeling remained honest. Outside my window, the harbor shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, my son was finally beginning to understand that losing sight of someone often happens long before they disappear. 3 weeks passed before I finally listened to all of Ethan's messages in order. By then, my new routine had settled into place. I joined the Saturday walking group. I became a regular at the local bookstore. Every Wednesday morning, I volunteered for 2 hours at the town library, helping organize donated books. My apartment overlooked the harbor, and each evening I watched fishing boats return as the sun slipped behind the water. The loneliness I had feared never truly arrived. There were quiet moments, certainly. Moments when I missed my husband. Moments when I wished things had unfolded differently with my son. But there was a difference between missing someone and losing yourself while waiting for them. One rainy afternoon, I sat beside the window with a blanket across my lap and listened to another voicemail. Ethan sounded exhausted. "Mom, I found some of your old records at the storage facility. The manager said you cleared almost everything out before leaving. I had no idea you were planning something this big." He paused. "I keep thinking about our conversation. I should have said yes. I know that now." I stared at the gray sky beyond the glass. The strange thing was that his refusal no longer hurt. The wound had already healed into something quieter. Understanding, perhaps. Or acceptance. A few days later, Carol called from Colorado. We spoke for nearly an hour. She told me Ethan had stopped by her apartment several times asking questions. According to her, he looked troubled. Not angry. Not defensive. Troubled. "He keeps asking whether you seemed upset," Carol said. "What did you tell him?" I asked. She laughed softly. "I told him the truth. I told him you seemed determined." After we hung up, I thought about that word for a long time. Determined. Years ago, people might have called me dependable, generous, patient. Those qualities had defined much of my life. Yet determination felt different. Stronger. It belonged entirely to me. The following weekend, I attended a community picnic near the waterfront. Families gathered beneath large trees while children played on the grass. I sat with several new friends and listened to conversations about gardening, travel, and retirement. Nobody knew my history. Nobody saw me as someone's mother first. They simply saw Ava. It was surprisingly refreshing. That evening, when I returned home, I found an envelope waiting outside my door. Inside was a handwritten letter forwarded from Colorado. The handwriting belonged to Ethan. I sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the pages carefully. The first sentence stopped me cold. "Mom, I think I spent so many years assuming you would always be there that I forgot to ask whether you were happy." I read those words twice. Then a third time. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, I continued reading, slowly realizing that for the first time in a very long while, my son was no longer speaking to the version of me he had taken for granted. He was finally trying to see the person I had become. For several days, Ethan's letter remained folded on my kitchen table. I would read a few paragraphs in the morning, then return to it later in the afternoon. There was no attempt to excuse his choices. No effort to blame Julie or circumstances. Instead, there was something far more difficult to write and far more difficult to receive. Honesty. He admitted that he had become distracted by work, responsibilities, and the routines of daily life. He admitted that he had slowly started viewing me as someone who would always be fine on her own because I always had been. Most of all, he admitted that when I asked for help, he heard an inconvenience instead of a mother. One sentence stayed with me more than any other. "I thought you needed a place to stay for a week." I never stopped to consider that maybe you needed to feel wanted. I sat quietly after reading those words. Outside, fishing boats moved slowly across the harbor beneath a bright afternoon sky. The water sparkled in the sunlight. Somewhere nearby, gulls called to one another. Life continued exactly as it had the day before. Yet something inside me felt lighter. Not because the past had changed. It had not. But because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. A week later, I received another surprise. A local friend from the walking group called to tell me someone had been asking about me at a nearby coffee shop. At first, I assumed it was a simple misunderstanding. Then my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. This time, I answered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I heard him take a slow breath. "Mom?" "Hello, Ethan." His voice sounded different. Softer. Older somehow. "I am in Oregon," he said. I looked out my window toward the harbor. "I know." He laughed quietly. "How did you know?" "A mother usually knows." Another silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just careful. "Could we meet?" he asked. I thought about the question. Months earlier, I might have answered immediately. Now I allowed myself time. Yes, I said. We can meet. The next afternoon, we sat across from one another at a small cafe overlooking the water. Ethan looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. He spent a long moment studying my face before speaking. You look happy, he finally said. I smiled. I am. He glanced around the cafe, the harbor, the people passing by outside. You built a whole new life. Yes. Without telling anyone. I stirred my coffee slowly. I spent many years explaining myself, Ethan. This time, I needed to listen to myself instead. He lowered his eyes. For a moment, he looked like the little boy from the old photographs. Not because he was helpless. Because he was finally willing to learn. As the afternoon sun reflected across the water between us, I realized this meeting was not about forgiveness. That had already happened. It was about understanding. And for the first time in a very long while, understanding seemed possible. After our conversation at the cafe, Ethan remained in Oregon for 2 more days. We walked along the harbor one morning, stopping occasionally to watch fishing boats return with their catch. We visited the bookstore, where I volunteered, and the small bakery where I had become a regular customer. I introduced him to people who knew me simply as Ava. Not someone's mother. Not someone's widow. Just Ava. I could see the surprise in his eyes each time someone greeted me warmly or stopped to chat. For years, he had only seen the version of me that existed within the boundaries of family obligations. Now he was seeing the life I had built beyond them. On his final evening in town, we sat on a bench overlooking the water as the sun began to disappear beyond the horizon. The harbor glowed with soft shades of gold and orange. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. I kept thinking you left because I said no. I looked out toward the boats drifting gently in the distance. That was part of it, I said honestly. But it was not the whole reason. He nodded slowly. Then why? I folded my hands in my lap and considered the question carefully. Because your answer forced me to see something I had been avoiding for years. He turned toward me. What was that? I smiled gently. I had spent so much of my life making room for everyone else that I forgot to make room for myself. The words seemed to settle between us. He looked down at the wooden planks beneath our feet. I am sorry, Mom. It was a simple sentence. No excuses. No explanations. Just truth. I reached over and squeezed his hand. I know. We sat quietly after that. The apology did not erase the past. It did not need to. Some things are not repaired by pretending they never happened. They are repaired by finally understanding why they mattered. The next morning, Ethan left for Colorado. Before he walked through airport security, he hugged me longer than usual. Will you come visit? He asked. Sometimes, I replied with a smile. And you can visit me too. He laughed softly. I think I would like that. Months passed. Seasons changed. Life continued. We spoke regularly, but differently than before. Our conversations felt more intentional. More honest. There was no expectation that I would return to my old life, and no pressure to become who I used to be. One evening, nearly a year after I arrived in Oregon, I stood beside my window watching the harbor lights reflect across the water. My apartment felt warm. Peaceful. Home. My phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. A photograph appeared on the screen. It showed him and Julie standing beside a newly planted tree in their backyard. The caption was short. Thinking of you today. I smiled and set the phone down. Some people believe the happiest endings are the ones where everything returns to the way it was before. I disagree. The happiest endings are the ones where people finally grow into who they were meant to become. I did not leave because I stopped loving my son. I left because I finally learned how to love myself too.